And I just turned around and I hauled ass out of there. I was done. I wasn't dealing with that.
The hypocrisy of the cult is one of the things that turned me away the quickest.
When I turned my headlights on, it turned and looked at us. And one of the things I remember the most were the eyes were glowing red.
I see an orb of light. It is just circling these steps like it is waiting for me.
And he begins to tell them that he saw a UFO. They're basically like, what are you talking about? That's 7 foot up on a tree, peeking around it. And that's where I saw the top of the muzzle, nose, and the eyes. As soon as I made eye contact with this thing, it felt like death.
Welcome back to Tinfoil Tells. I'm your host, Brandon Wright. Tonight we're going to be joined by my guest, Mark. Mark is the host of My Family Thinks I'm Crazy podcast. I reached out to Mark a while back to come on here and talk a little bit about some stuff tonight. The name of his podcast kind of resonates with me because I think everyone thinks I'm crazy too, but each their own, I guess. Before we bring Mark on, though, if you've ever had an experience and you'd like to be on an episode of Tinfoil Tells, please send an email to tinfoiltellspodcast@gmail.com or go to tinfoiltells.com into the contact section, and you can send me a message that way. Whatever way works for you works for me, so just make sure to send me a message. We'll get something scheduled for a future episode. If you'd like to help the podcast out, please continue to share it around. Every time you share the podcast, that's a potential new guest listening. They could have a story they want to share. It helps the podcast continue to grow, finds new listeners. So every time you share, just know I appreciate you guys doing that. You're really helping me out. You're helping the podcast grow. It's much appreciated. You can also leave a 5-star rating and review. And if you write a review for Apple, I will give you a shout out on a future episode. If you want to help the podcast, you can also join the Patreon. There is a free section. It gives you access to Crinkle Conspiracies, the new Patreon exclusive podcast that's going on only on the Patreon. There's also ad-free content, early access to all the episodes right after they're recorded. That is only $1.99 a month for full access. There's some other things on there too, like the live videos. I got some other things in the works. So it's worth checking out. You can find that in the show notes. This fall, I'll be appearing at Bigfoots and Brews and Spirits 2 on September 14th at Dowagiac, Michigan at the Sister Lakes Brewing Company. I'll also be at the Indiana Bigfoot Conference, September 27th and 28th in Nashville, Indiana. On October 19th, I'll be at Para Unity 6 in Miami County, Indiana at the Miami County 4-H Fairgrounds. And on October 26th, I'll be in Crawfordsville, Indiana for the Crawfordsville Paranormal Conference. More information regarding those will be included in the show notes. Make sure to come out and stop by my booth. If you have a story you'd like to share, I'll have my recording rig out there so we can sit down and talk about it. Make sure to follow us on all social medias. Facebook, Instagram is where I'm most active. Look for Brandon Tinfoil Tells. You can find me on Facebook that way. We can chat on there too. But I think now we're going to go ahead and bring Mark on. I said earlier, his podcast, the name of it kind of resonates with me. I'm looking forward to talking with him tonight. Hope you guys enjoy the episode. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. I'd like to take time to welcome my guest tonight, Mark Palmer from My Family Thinks I'm Crazy podcast. Mark, thanks for coming on here talking to me tonight.
Yeah, thanks, Brandon, for having me. It's cool to be on the show. And my show's called My Family Thinks I'm Crazy. I didn't just pull that out of a random name generator. It's a thought that kind of hit me around the same time that this podcast started, and it spoke to a feeling that I had had my whole life, but it really it got exaggerated, I guess, when everything hit the fan, as we say, in 2020. And that's around the same time that my show started, October 2020. And I've been doing 2 episodes a week at least ever since. And it's a lot of fun. I've talked to a bunch of really intelligent people that I once, as a podcast listener, enjoyed listening to. So it's been really awesome opportunity to, participate and engage in the conversations that for the most part I was just spending a lot of time listening to and feeling like, I should start my own show, and never really did until um, around 2018. I kind of got a show going, and then eventually that was a different show than the one I do now. And it was completely different, not online. I didn't have any equipment. I just recorded it on my phone with some friends in a room. And then one thing led to another. I go to a Sam Tripoli comedy show. I meet Sam, talk to him for a little bit. He invites me on his Patreon. And at that point, I thought, well, I'm in it. Here's the guy that I've been listening to, among others, and might as well get involved. So, yeah, it's been really fun, and I'm really grateful to work with Sam Tripoli as well as a booker, which is a whole different story, but connected in a way. But yeah, after meeting Sam at the comedy show, I went on his podcast a couple times, and then eventually he asked me to help him produce a podcast that he does called Zero, a spiritual podcast, and I helped him find guests, and eventually he asked me to do the same for his more popular podcast, the Tinfoil Hat podcast, and yeah, so that's where I'm at as far as my podcasting job, which is really cool because around the same time I started this podcast, I left a job as an Amazon delivery driver, which I got into that whole job field because I loved podcasts so much. And I'm like, well, if I'm a delivery driver, I'll get paid and I can listen to podcasts all day without somebody, looking over my shoulder or saying, hey, we'll come look at this. I got no real reason to, as long as I'm focused on the road, of course, no reason I can't listen to podcasts, right? So yeah, it was a great learning experience. I spent a couple years doing that, and all these different synchronicities that I'm sure, based on how you described your show, we might be able to get into some of these synchronicities. It really started to dawn on me and add up, and I thought, well, sure, there's people who've written books about this topic, but I don't see many people speaking about it in a regular, active way. And I'm sort of local to the whole topic, so I took my own personal experiences and what I could find as far as research, and I've begun studying New Haven, Connecticut, and Yale University, and of course, Skull and Bones, which is probably the most infamous of the three. Most people probably have heard of Skull and Bones and maybe think it's at Harvard or one of the Ivy League schools or something, but it's at Yale University, and that's in New Haven, Connecticut, which is America's first planned city. And growing up some ways away from New Haven, I never really interacted with the city because when I was a kid, it was like most cities in America in the 90s, not the best place to take your kids, I guess. But I had a few memories there. I went to this big arena called the Coliseum and saw the Ringling Brothers Circus before the Coliseum eventually was torn down, and later learned that, Led Zeppelin and all these great acts like AC/DC and Van Halen came and crushed it at this Coliseum. It's kind of interesting now looking back, like, oh, there's one, that it kind of just dawned on me just now as I'm retelling all this stuff. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't want to just keep rambling on. I don't know how much you've listened to my show or know about what I'm prepared to talk about. So I'll just let you kind of steer me along as you see fit. But yeah, essentially what I'm getting around to saying is around the same time I was in college, which was 8 or so years before I ever did a podcast, let alone, I listened to a podcast maybe 5 or 6 years after this point. So this was all before I even knew what a podcast was. I was in New Haven as a college student and was taking a course that I really enjoyed, anthropology. And outside of that, I really didn't enjoy anything else about college. It just felt like another version of high school. And also,
Mm-hmm.
there was this very large, sort of grass is greener perspective or feeling being in New Haven because, I mean, the town is dominated by Yale University, right? It's older than the country itself, right? So it's a big entity and it takes up a lot of real estate in New Haven. So I became really curious about all of the things going on there. And with my, I guess ego, I guess intellectual ego, I felt like, oh, well, what makes them better than me other than the thousands of dollars they get or put
Right.
into being into this school, right? Like, but yeah, as I was saying, it kind of jaded me a little bit to being in New Haven, and also fascinated me because this, school had been around for hundreds of years. All these different people had gone there, and so many interesting things that happen in this city that you hear a lot about Boston or Philadelphia or even New York City, but when it comes to New Haven, I was surprised to find out how large of a role this place played in American history as well, and even some things about American history that most people don't know about. The secret history of America, we'll say things that involve groups like the Freemasons or the oil barons or the railroad tycoons. Name your pick. Any of the villains of yesteryear America. Have stomped the grounds of the hallowed grounds of New Haven, Connecticut. And as a college student, I just really, you know, I didn't fully understand it, but I sensed something, and I met a couple people there that kind of helped me clue myself into some of these things that I'm now well aware of. So it's been a process, just the journey as it unfolds. It's unique for each person, but just given the circumstance and the setting, I've found it kind of odd now how my life looking back, like, oh wow, yeah, they all these things did kind of lead to me having this podcast in one way or another. I mean, such is life for most people, I'm sure, but very rarely do people have the opportunity as we do now with our generation. I assume we're around the same age, or maybe you're a little older than me, but we have this really great opportunity to get involved in a I hate to call it an industry, but to
Mm-hmm.
utilize a technology like podcasting and the internet to discuss things that, for the most part, were relegated to exclusive groups, even, Yale University with their, intellectual superiority complexes. Um, there's a sort of gate between the average person and a lot of this information that's been opened up wider and wider with the advent of the internet and now with the advent of podcasting, because I think most people in my generation, at least, who grew up with television, maybe not the same way I did, but in the way I did, we have a attention span issue or some other, I don't know, name your pick of crazy social disorders they want to throw at us. But I don't really ascribe myself to any of that nonsense. I just know that when I found podcasting, it like clicked in a few buttons that just weren't available with television or reading on the internet, although I did enjoy that. And I do enjoy reading, but as a nonfiction reader, I'm not turning chapters as often as I'd like, and podcasting helps with that. Nonfiction, in my experience, is a little harder to make your way through. It's a little denser, choppier water than, let's say, like a novel or some prose or something sweet like that. It's reading nonfiction can be a chore sometimes. So podcasting has helped in many ways because it's kind of helped me rewire my compass, also see, what else is being discussed. Some of the more sensational ideas that don't seem so sensational when you read them on paper, but when you hear some of the people talking about these things, you're like, hold on a second.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I really value with podcasting. And of course, having conversations like this with someone like yourself who's already been very generous to me to let me just speak on and on and on like this. And I try to do the same on my show to let the guests, say their piece and spill the beans, however they feel comfortable doing so. But yeah, as far as Skull and Bones, Yale University, and the secret history of America, I'm very interested in all that, and especially interested in pre-Columbian history, although I hate to even use that term because Columbus really didn't discover America, as most people probably already know. And I don't say that from the statue dragger perspective where we want to, dishevel history and help people forget and continue the horrible mental contagion that is this identity amnesia that we have as humanity. I'm not into that, but I do think Columbus, has a lot of myth more than fact. At least what's taught to us about him is a lot more myth than fact. So, yeah, I'm interested in all that as well. So, I'll leave it to you. Like, what are you interested in, and I mean, what questions do you have at this point after I've said my piece?
Well, I'd like to dive into the skull and bone thing. That's something I haven't actually covered here, so it'd be something I'd like to hear more about. But no, you and you and I have the similar mindset with the guests and everything. I don't speak. I let them talk, and I don't like to interrupt people, so I let them just. When the guest comes on here, it's pretty much their show. They go where they want to go with it. So it's pretty much up to you of where you want to start at and where you want to go. And like I said, I won't interrupt. I might ask a question here or there, but for the most part, it's all your floor at this point.
All right. Yeah. So, there are authors, researchers, journalists, even who have covered the topic of skull and bones. So I'm not going to repeat any of the information that you can easily find from those authors like Anthony Sutton, Chris Milligan, and the book he compiled with several other authors called Fleshing Out Skull and Bones. I mean, if anybody wants to get a 101, that would be a very, very detailed place to start. I'm sure any run of the mill podcast will give you the, Wikipedia facts about skull and bones. And I don't spend that much time on all that because I'm very interested in cutting past the disinformation and seeing what's really going on, which is difficult when you're talking about secret societies, right? So you sort of have to study, at least what I've surmised from my conversations and my experiences. You sort of have to, you know, understand this entity by its actions, not so much by its appearances, right? Sort of similar to studying something like an elusive predator, like a black panther, right? Before trail cams and this sort of thing, scientists would have to figure out what these creatures were doing, largely, obviously observations aside, largely by what these creatures leave behind, evidence, this sort of thing, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that with secret societies, it's sort of a similar dynamic because it's the operations, the organizations, they work in a very fluid way, and I think they've almost perfected. I hate to say perfected because it's not. There's nothing perfect about it.
Yeah, there's nothing perfect out there.
But they've perfected, we'll call it an algorithm, a mechanical algorithm through the structure of society. And it has to do with class, it has to do with bloodlines or ethnicity, although the ideas of race have very much clouded what humans used to understand as ethnicity, or maybe even um, tribal origin, because every country has its tribes. It's not just the Native Americans or the people on remote islands, right? So this sort of political underpin of like genetics, because there is a political nature to genetics, and ethnicity, of course, that has now been kind of conflated to race. These are the, I don't know, you could call them smoke screens, but it's more like curtains in front of the wizard with his machine, and Dorothy comes and pulls the curtain off, right? So none of it is uh, altogether, uh, you know, unobvious. I hate to, it doesn't really make sense, unobvious, but it's in our faces. It's hidden in plain sight. That's kind of the point I'm trying to make, right? And because there's an imperative to create a problem and a reaction and then impose a pre-planned solution, things kind of move in this slow way where, all right, we got to create this, force in society, and then people are going to react this way, and then we're going to get our agenda one step further when we impose this solution for the people who need our help, right? This is the kind of psychology that the secret societies have informed our government with. Like, government has almost become not a religious or a hierarchical kind of tribal order situation. Has become more of like a back scratching influence pool, right? Like it's all about like whose influence is mightier than another's, and they're influencing the agenda towards something. I don't know what it is. Seems like apocalyptic type thinking. Seems like it has a sort of old world religious factor to it. That's where a lot of this occult type of stuff comes from, in my opinion. The very ancient cultures that have been, for the most part, forgotten, and now are being studied again in a wide fashion that maybe was relegated to these secret groups for prior 100 or 200 years or so. But yeah, when it comes to Skull and Bones, again, like I'm trying to say a lot without saying it in a way that, you know, exaggerates it to a point where I sound sensational. But it is kind of, shockingly connected system. Like, you look at some of these families that have been established in America. Not only do most of them have connections to either Harvard or Yale, as well as the other Ivy League schools, which are kind of, if not equals, kind of like, like, I don't know, offspring of the first two, because Yale itself is a sort of creation of Harvard. It was founded by people who were all educated at Harvard. So there's a kind of like incestual nature to all these Ivy League schools and how they form. And then go beyond that, as those got established, they then created these people who went on to establish, Stanford University, John Hopkins University. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. Any place where universities, government, high science experiments, where these things intersect, put the magnifying glass on it and study, because this is, read between the lines. There's a lot going on in the world today. And what do conspiracy theorists say a lot of times in many different ways? They're trying to kill us, right? Well, why would they try to kill, the people that they are benefiting off of, right? If they're exploiting us, if they created this big system to just exploit us, what use is there in killing off all of us, right? Because the farmer doesn't just kill off all his cattle or at once, he leaves some of them alive. You kill what you need at that time, but you're not going to just cull your whole herd unless, there's a huge extreme problem. So I wonder if that's not maybe the primary objective. It could be a part of it. It could be a secondary or tertiary objective, but when it comes to the higher order of things, when you start looking into the occult aspects of things, it does seem like we're dealing with an organization that has a spiritual belief that goes above what we're taught are normal human ethical values, normal human morals, the traditional laws that most, if not all, cultures agree upon. It's wrong to kill another person. It's wrong to steal from another person. These are people that, for lack of a better word, they don't care about these rules, right? I mean, it's more nuanced and complicated than that, but there's a spiritual reckoning behind something that seems absolutely evil and brutal to us. And I'm not saying that to justify it by any means, but we're recording this in April 2024. If you're alive and aware and awake, you've been seeing things about cannibals in Haiti and even in California. And, I, I wouldn't put it past certain groups of people to have a very different worldview about how they can treat other human beings. And of course, they're going to want us all, the rest of us, to think, oh, yeah, no, everybody just it's eye for an eye, treat each other the way you want to be treated. That's the party line. That's the status quo. Don't worry, folks. We're not going to send your kids out to die in some barren mountain landscape in the middle of the Himalayan bluffs. No way. So yeah, I think that's kind of the main idea with Skull and Bones, as far as like what's important. And then you get into like the more sophisticated aspects or the other aspects of it, and you have connections to the opioid crisis. You have connections to the entire gas and oil industry. You have all these connections, of course. I mean, it's Ivy League, so you have all these Wall Street connections. And that's kind of the back door where you have the military, racketeering and warmongering, right? All of these things are really connected. And when you study Connecticut as a state, it's the home of multiple different defense contractors, military companies that have invented everything from the submarine to the helicopter to certain types of optical fibers that are now used in satellites. I mean, all sorts of interesting things get invented in Connecticut, Massachusetts, and now, California. But really, California was settled by people from the East Coast. That was all after Skull and Bones had already been around. Most of the West Coast states were being, populated. So there's a whole story there. And I don't know what state you're in, but
Indiana.
Okay, and you seem like you're in a positive state, which is good too. State of mind. But no, I've been to Indiana. I like Indiana. I've been to Indianapolis. I've been down all the way. What's that? Bloomington down.
Bloomington, what are you?
Been down there. I like Indiana. It's definitely one of my favorite places I've visited. And I think
It's not a state to live in, that's for sure. But
I
I've
I
been
don't
here for
know.
40 years.
Listen, I'm from Connecticut, so it's like, that we have a low bar, I guess, is what I'm
Mhm.
saying. It's beautiful here, but for whatever reason, I did like, I don't know, I liked Indiana. So, anyways, aside from that, yeah, I think when it comes to certain states, like I think it's Oregon, it's entirely Freemasonic. Texas even has tons of Freemasonic elements. I wouldn't be surprised, considering what I saw in Indianapolis, if Freemasons had something to do with the founding of that. And I'm not saying that Freemasons and Skull and Bones are synonymous, but when you look at when Skull and Bones was formed in 1832, it was at the height of what some people who are historians call the mass panic, or social panic, something like that, Masonic panic. And it had to do with the amount of Freemasons throughout the government, and a scandal that occurred where a man was murdered by Freemasons, and his death was covered up. His name is William Morgan, and I think the story goes is that they threw him over Niagara Falls, because this was in the state of New York, and he was a Freemason himself, or at least spent some time with Freemasons enough to write an expose, which I think he was a Freemason, because that's a big no-no. If you're not a Freemason, you could write all you want about Freemasons, but at that time, as a Freemason, I don't know if it's still true today, because you have Freemasons that publish books by, companies that are outright Freemasonic, but yeah, it was just a different time. And, I'm not saying that Freemasons today don't have some things that need to be looked at, but when we look at history, it's a different context today, and probably much deeper than most people realize, as far as like the degrees go and the upper echelons of the lodges. Not all lodges are made equal. There's, kind of farm league lodges, and then you have your pros, the major leagues, and so on and so forth of the
That's
lodges. And
I'd
Skull and
say the one that we have here in this town is definitely not major league. I didn't even know it existed
Oh
until
yeah.
I know where it's at. But I've never seen anyone there, but apparently it's still open. And I was like, well, I don't think they're doing any of that shady stuff that you hear about.
Yeah, well, and that's the thing. It's like these guys are movers and shakers. They're moving and shaking to wherever's cooking the bacon, like
Hmm.
that's so, the same is true for any probably Rust Belt area, or any like, former mining town or something like that, right? Like you did have lodges when business was booming, and then when business stops booming, the Freemasons go where the business goes. That's the traveling man, right? So I'm not an expert in Freemasonry, but I have tried to learn as much as I can as it pertains to the history of the United States, and how they might connect to Skull and Bones. But I say all this to say that, Skull and Bones was kind of formed as a way to separate itself from the bad taste in the American collective consciousness that had formed around Freemasonry. So they used to have these things called debating societies, which were sort of outright Freemasonry, in the sense that like Freemasonry has always brought like the classics into what was traditionally maybe Christian biblical educational system, where the Bible and maybe some literature from the time would be used. The Freemasons introduced the very much the ideas surrounding, the classical revival. They're like bringing all those things into America, as far as like the appreciation of the Greek culture, and how that's kind of molded into the university system. This is very much something that it wasn't limited to the Freemasons. There were non-Freemasons, of course, who were participating in it. But when you look at the arc of history, It starts with certain groups, whether they're real or not. Rosicrucian is how they've been remembered in European history, and they sort of preceded, these intellectual groups of so-called Rosicrucians preceded official speculative Freemasonry. And all around this same time, you have, the printing press being invented and all these sorts of books being taken from whatever, scroll holder in the library they had been on, and maybe republishing certain things that they wanted people to learn about, right? So there's a lot of information in the library. Let's start, giving the people some of this information, folks, but who's going to give them the information? It's not fair game, open season. It's take what we give you and like it. And that's kind of, it wasn't the initial inspiration, I'm sure, with some of the more idealistic people involved in universities and involved in religious groups that helped create universities. I think there's a lot of really great, brilliant, amazing people. Don't get me wrong, I'm not a cynic. I even think a lot of these Freemasons had, some really great things that they did and contributed to culture and society. But it takes a turn for the worst at a certain point in history, and then we start to see, a veritable slave state formed in many parts of the world, let alone just this country. Not that they hadn't already been worse in some places. Of course, the modern world is more hygienic than anything humans have in recorded history. But I think aside from that, we still have a lot of issues and problems, and people wonder, like, well, how can all these elites, just control everything? Well, this is how. All
Yeah.
the corporations that we have were created at a time where, Freemasonic groups and these kind of like institutions, like, they were all part and parcel, doing sort of similar things. The whole idea of pirates is really like myth to obscure the real history of these criminals that were doing all sorts of crazy things. And drug trafficking, right? Like, drug trafficking didn't just come out of nowhere. Like, these guys sailing around, established in these port cities in colonial America, and young America in the 19th century, like, they were all continuing this kind of trade, this illicit trade, and that's where all the big money was. I mean, I'm kind of going all over the place because it is such a varied thing, but, like, I guess to bring things maybe back to a more tangible level, what really astounded me about Skull and Bones and Yale University is just how in your face a lot of the symbolism is. I don't know, maybe some people think of it as just like spooky, you know, atmosphere or something. Like, they don't, or they think it's just like, timely, like it's just like a antique kind of thing. But when I look at it, I see like Egyptian, I see like, I'm not reading into it. It is explicitly inspired by Egyptian architecture. Some of the buildings in New Haven, but there are these like little clues in the architecture, and that's what got me thinking about Freemasonry. That's what got me thinking about Skull and Bones. Got me thinking about rituals and what they're really doing. Because, we've all heard the rumors, oh, yeah, they lie in the coffin and they blackmail each other with their sexual secrets. And it's just a way for rich people to stay in the same club with people they trust. That's all it is. It's just, you would do it too if you were rich, right? You would do it too. Don't worry. Don't think about it too much, because you would do it too, right? Like, that's what a lot of the Skull and Bones research reflects, is this attitude. But when you look deeper, you see that, all right, Skull and Bones' tomb, as they call it, their headquarters, is right next to the art museum. And when I looked deeper, I found out that the original art museum was smaller, and then they built upon the art museum and created a second building across the street, and then they connected the two art buildings with this really interesting bridge. And this bridge just so happens to be right in front of where you would see Skull and Bones if you were going down. I think it's. Oh, I haven't been in New Haven long enough because I'm forgetting the name of the street. It might be Crown Street, but that's probably not it. Elm Street. Either way, there's a street that's very trafficked, and the art museum wing just happens to kind of obscure your view of the Skull and Bones building if you're on this main street. So just that, noticing that kind of made me think, and then I looked into it, and it turns out, well, the art museum was named after a guy that was connected to Skull and Bones. And then the guy who owned the property actually bought it from Skull and Bones, or traded hands with the people who owned Skull and Bones, the Russell Trust, because before the second edition of the art museum was built, there were dorm buildings on that block, and those were the dorm buildings that the members of Skull and Bones would habituate. Those were where they stayed as a student, right? You were provided a boarding room, and this is at the time when there are only men at the school, right? It wasn't co-ed at that time, and it certainly wasn't diverse, right? It's only men of a certain religion. So it's kind of like an ethno state. But yeah, they, as interesting as that is, considering what's going on in the world today. But yeah, so you have this school that, you know, some of the richest, wealthiest people in America at the time are sending their children to. And this kind of like occult group is picking the best and the brightest to be initiated. And then they're right there connected to the art museum, which just so happens to not only have some of the most priceless, valuable pieces of art in the world in it now, currently. I mean, it took them a while to get there, but it initially was where the painter of the American Revolution was buried. So the painter of the American Revolution, I believe his name was John Trumbull. He is the most famous American painter of his style and type, mostly because of his pieces in the White House and at Congress and different important American government buildings. He painted like the famous Declaration of Independence painting. And so all of his paintings were kept in New Haven in this building called the Tomb. It was a giant, just stone tomb looking building. They called it the Tomb because it had no windows. And because, you know, at the time, right, we're talking about 18th century technology, they're not, you know, using what we use today to preserve art. They had to keep it in a very dark room and keep the area from getting too humid so you couldn't have any mold, right? So all these different things that they had to do to keep you know, the paint and the art preserved at this time period. You know, the easiest way to do that would be a windowless stone building, right? So they build this stone building, and that eventually is replaced by the what is now the art museum, the first art museum. And then across the block, they create a larger art museum, connect the two, and that larger wing of the art museum is where the dorms for Skull and Bones used to be, right next to Skull and Bones' tomb, which still stands there today, obviously. They also have like this little secret courtyard area behind the tomb. So, you know, there's probably a reason why they want a giant art museum right there, kitty cornered next to the tomb, so that people can't snoop over to their secret garden that they do secret things in. I mean, who the heck knows? There was a ABC reporter in like 2008 when I think it was, or maybe 2000 and whenever George H.W. Bush ran against John Kerry for his second term. That was 2004. So
Yeah.
around then, the whole country was talking about Skull and Bones because John Kerry and George H.W. Bush Jr., or is it just, no, it's just W, George W. Bush Jr., were running against each other. And of course, they're both members of Skull and Bones, I believe, even like within a few years of each other because they were around the same age. So they might have known each other at Yale. I could be wrong about that, but they are both alumni of Skull and Bones, and a ton of the honest journalists that actually, wow, existed at that point in time, that actually had a job with a newspaper or a television company. Can you believe that? Not today, but yeah, so there were honest reporters. I know it sounds crazy, folks, that were, trying to figure out whatever they could about Skull and Bones since the rumors were in the air. And yeah, one of them climbed on top of the art museum and filmed into the secret courtyard during one of their rituals, which happened right around this time of year, actually. Not this month, but next month. I don't know when you'll release this episode, but in May, they initiate their future knights, because when you graduate from Skull and Bones, you're considered a knight. I don't know what the initiates are called when you're. I think it's just bonesmen, maybe. I don't know. They probably have a special name for it that I forgot. But they're initiated on May 15th. So then there's some, things that go on afterwards. We can assume. They also have a island in the Thousands Island region of upstate New York. I bet you didn't know that Thousands Islands dressing is referring to an island in upstate New York and not the tropical islands. I always thought Thousand Island dressing was like from the Bahamas or something.
Yeah. I didn't know it was from New York.
It's from Canada, basically. Right up there in the Canadian-New York border, there are all these islands called the Thousand Islands. And Skull and Bones has basically like an island property, this like old stone building, some sort of mansion that I don't know who built it, but they were notable. A notable person built it and then sold it, and Skull and Bones uses it. Most likely to this day, maybe not. I'm sure, this was in the 90s when this information came out. So I'm sure in 2020, they probably have like an Epstein Island set up at this point, a tropical island rather than a cold, mosquito-filled Michigan-style island up there. And I don't know, what is it, the St. Lawrence River that connects or
I'm not sure.
Canada from New York up there. But either way, that's where their island is, and my assumption is, that's the summer ritual. You just get initiated into Skull and Bones. You finish your junior year of college, and next thing you know, you get an invitation to come out and hang out with your new friends on this island. And who the heck knows what happens up there, all the way on, what is it, an international border? So, yeah, it has trafficking written all over it, but who knows what they're doing up there in the summer. But then they come back for senior year, and yeah, I'm sure a bunch of also, strange rituals ensue. I don't know when that footage was taken, but it seems like to me it would have been after the tap ritual in May, because that's when people have an idea of like Skull and Bones' schedule. Really, nothing else beyond that is public about their rituals, right? They initiate their members on the 15th of May. They used to do it in this big ceremonial kind of way in the what they call the old quad, which was the original building that Yale inhabited, and now they've expanded much larger than that, so it's not really a central location anymore for the campus. fun fact, what is a central location for the campus is the world's first, I'm sorry, I got really, really full of myself there. America's first cemetery. So it's not America's first graveyard. It's definitely not America's first burial ground, but it's America's first planned cemetery. That's right at the center of Yale's campus. The actual geographical center is the Schwartzman Hall, which is named after the guy who owns, is it BlackRock or the other one that has a similar weird name, Blackstone, is it? Something like that, right? So something that conveys something sinister. Blackstone, BlackRock, something like that. I don't remember which one. But yeah, America's first cemetery. It's billed when it was created as the Garden of the Dead, and the gateway to the cemetery is on the same road. It's facing the road. It's called High Street, and that road is the road that Skull and Bones' tomb is on, as well as another secret society at Yale, which has a more impressive, I'll say, tomb. Theirs is white with these giant Doric pillars and a wrought iron black gate fence that's, striped with the caduceus. Like each fence post is a caduceus with the snake facing the snake, and not the medical one, but like the original alchemical one. I don't know the official name of it, but I think caduceus is good enough. People who've been to a doctor know what I'm talking about. But yeah, it's just odd that this street, which has America's first cemetery, kind of just like, hey, walk on down the road into the cemetery gates, right? Like it's this road leading to that. And at the entrance to the cemetery is an Egyptian style gate made out of the same exact stone from the same quarry as the tomb on Yale Skull and Bones tomb. There are multiple tombs in New Haven, so I'm getting a little tomb tongue-tied. So, but when it comes to the gate in New Haven on the cemetery, it has the phrase, which is from the Bible, "The dead shall be raised." Right. So, kind of a interesting way to greet people as they enter the cemetery, where the man who first published Webster's dictionary, Noah Webster. If I had my list in front of me, I could tell you all the other famous people that are buried there. Not exactly notable people that everybody would recognize, but people that are fundamentally important to the history of America in unique ways. So yeah, it's kind of like a who's who of who's buried there. And there's a funny story behind it. New Haven, like I said, being the first planned city in America, originally the dead were buried behind the three churches that are at the center of the 9-square grid that makes up New Haven's zoning and planning, right? When you look at the map of New Haven, the layout of the city is in a 9-square grid arrangement, kind of like, what is it, a tic-tac-toe board, right? So in the center square, you have the green, which is like a actual green. It's like a park. I don't know if you call your town squares greens out there in Indiana, but that's kind of like, we say that here in the East Coast. I don't know if that.
I don't think I've ever heard it called that. So
yeah, out in the East Coast, we call it the green. So like you have like your center of town, you'll have like the town hall and like a church, and like it's a very colonial layout. Towns that were made after the colonial time probably don't conform to this layout. Now there's like, maybe like the National Mall in Washington D.C. is a good way to put it, right? It's just like a big stretch of grass. So we have one of those, and there's three churches all facing the east, right next to each other, shoulder to shoulder, on this green. And behind them are over 6,000 bodies buried from this time period. And when they decided to build a full cemetery, they moved certain people who were buried and left everyone else. So, this place that has kind of like it's just kind of like a park. There's pathways that just so happen to look like a pentagram from a bird's eye view, but there's pathways, we'll call them pathways, that just so happen to look like a pentagram, with benches and elm trees, because it is the elm city. Elm being a Saturnian tree, metaphysically. So there's another kind of bonesman, skull and bonesman, death head kind of thing. Saturn being the skull and bones kind of reaper, right? The Grateful Dead, that whole iconography. And that's very much a part of the whole 9 square grid thing too, because 9 is, I believe, no. There's 9 planets, but Saturn's not the 9th planet; it's the 6th planet. But
Is
yeah.
there 9 planets now? Because I thought they got rid of Pluto.
Well, you know what? Classically, there are 9 planets, and it does work a lot better as far as like the Platonic math. So I think they did that on purpose to just throw people off an octave. But who knows? Maybe it's Nibiru and not Pluto, and that's what's hiding out there in the 9th sphere. But yeah, I don't know. Space is murky, right? You start talking about space, and all of a sudden you lose half the audience. So I try not to talk about space, but yeah, when it comes to the metaphysical interpretations of these planets as gods or beings, or however the ancients conceptualized them, Saturn was never really the friendliest of the 8 or 9. So yeah, Saturn would have ate 9, right? That's the old joke. But no, Saturn is I think the classic image for Saturn is what? The Kronos eating his children, right? So, and when I say New Haven has like Saturnian kind of aspects to it, what I mean by that is the 9 square grid in the Kabbalah is symbolically connected to Saturn, which there's a Hebrew phrase for it, like chesed or something like that. I don't know what it's called, but each square arrangement, they have multiple different ones. There's 9 square grid, there's a 18 square grid, there's a 15 square grid, right? It's all depending on, what I mean by that is 9 squares in a grid. So 3 by 3 would be Saturn, right? That's kind of what we're talking about here. And, it's geometry. It's a little bit of, I don't know, kind of metaphysical, a little airy. But I think when you're talking about the first planned city in America, it is kind of an important aspect that they planned it in this way that is kind of in line with plans for Solomon's temple. At least that's how Solomon's temple's been drawn in this 3 by 3 square arrangement. For what reason, I'm not exactly sure, but also Solomon's temple's doors were oriented towards the east where the sun rises, and that's exactly how the churches at the center of New Haven are arranged. And there's all these different symbols. The tallest building in New Haven is I think 383 feet high, but the top 20 feet is like a I don't know, like a pagoda. It's not really a part of the building, and it's 20 feet high. So the real building is 363, and it's just kind of weird because when you do the math on where the building is, it's in the 6th square in this 3 by 3, and the name of the building is the blanking now, the Connecticut Financial Center, which is 363, right? Because C is the 3rd letter, F is the 6th letter of the alphabet. So there's just these weird little, I don't get into the gematria too much, but it is weird to notice that kind of stuff. 3 plus 6 equals 9. it's just, I don't know. I'm starting to see these things, and of course the tall building with the pagoda, what I call the pagoda, that's probably not the right term. It's shaped like a pyramid, and there's three pyramids on top of this building. So
Hmm.
it's just odd. You look at New Haven, just type in New Haven, Connecticut, and you'll see a Google image and you'll see exactly which building I'm talking about. And I think it's the second now, but it was or the third now. It was originally the second tallest building. Now it's the third tallest building. Is a building called the Knights of Columbus Tower, and that building is shaped very weird. I don't have my notes in front of me, but it resembles the shape of what's essentially like a Celtic cross. It's like a square with four circles at each corner, and there's different meanings for it depending on what culture you're looking at, but it is an ancient symbol. And it's the Knights of Columbus, so they're not like, again, they're not like top tier professional league secret society. They're probably closer to the farm league level, but I do think that they're relevant, and they're definitely relevant as far as New Haven just because of the real estate that they hold. But who knows? Maybe there's something going on there that's kind of deeper than that. But as far as like Yale goes, we have the first spy in American history whose statue is not only on Yale's campus, but it's at the CIA headquarters. The first spy, Nathan Hale, Yale, kind of similar, but I don't really stretch it that far. But Nathan Hale did graduate from Yale, and there's a fort. I think it's a National Guard fort right next to in New Haven that's named after him as well. So yeah, there's a little bit of like a secret service, espionage, spy kind of element to secret societies inherently. But as far as American history goes, most people may have heard that Skull and Bones helped found the CIA, or at least members of the CIA, the original CIA. Some of them were a part of Skull and Bones, right? So I don't think that's a coincidence by any stretch of the imagination, especially considering Nathan Hale and Yale go back that deep. I've kind of wondered, just because of the Anglo persuasion of Yale, whether or not England had maybe funded Yale and kind of, put Yale on their knee and said, "Hey, be a good sport and we'll take care of you. We know you're out there in the rough American country that we lost to. Oh, we really suffered a big loss there. So do us a few favors, won't you, and help those rugged patriots get back under the crown." Right? That's kind of where I think Yale and the Ivy Leagues fit into the history of America, but don't get me wrong, there's been tons of great people that have graduated from these schools. I'm not saying that they're all bad, but I wonder if one of many secret agendas to these universities were to bring American culture closer to European culture. And you really see that today with the social justice warrior nonsense and the woke maniacs that are, saying incredibly crazy things from, as high positions as the professor, the president of Harvard University, one of, if not the most respected American university. I think it is the oldest, at least the oldest of the Ivy Leagues, but might not be the oldest. I think the oldest school is the King's College in New York. But yeah, Oxford, Harvard, Yale, Cambridge, these are the top four, right? And you have kind of like this implied connection between those, even though two of them are absolutely British and the other two are in the closet British. So yeah, I think that's kind of and I haven't put my magnifying glass on Harvard too much, and I haven't on any of the other Ivy League schools. I've really just studied Yale. So, but Yale has its own like British museum on campus and other things that just scream, "Hey, we love England. We're still a part of England."
Back when it started, it was kind of around that whole time frame anyways, so I could see the whole English influence to it in general,
Oh,
just
yeah.
because.
Well, it was initially, I mean, outright funded by people who were, I mean, part of the British government. You know, it's named after a guy who was a governor of the British East India Company, uh,
Hmm.
Elihu Yale, and his name Yale that goes back to like Wales, funny enough, and some very deep families from there that have connections to royalty and have dragons on their crests and fancy things like that. But when it comes to uh, that time period, you're absolutely right. Like 1701 is when Yale began, I believe, and a lot of the money from the original, people that helped fund it, yeah, it was all British money or people who were making money through the English economy. And one of the champions of the American liberty was John Winthrop Jr., somebody who did help Yale, but in my opinion, wasn't somebody who was an enemy of America. He was very much a friend of what became like the American ideal, and championed the liberty here. Which I again, like, I don't think all Freemasons are bad. Skull and Bones, I won't say that for them. There's a certain elitist quality to Skull and Bones that I can't support. But when it comes to Freemasons, there are tons of Freemasons that helped, fight the Revolutionary War, and all of the history aside that's brought the federal government into fruition. That aside, I do believe in the Constitution, and I think the Constitution has value. And there were Freemasons starting that, so it's complicated. That it's more than just Freemasons. The Constitution is only Freemasons. No, it's more complicated than that. I realize it, but we can't look at things in this black and white kind of way especially when we're looking at history. And I hope I'm not going too far all over the place, but to get back to what you just said on the time period, yeah, Connecticut actually was one of the only colonies that never had the English as a government. So Saybrook Colony was where Yale was kind of thought up and founded, but then eventually Yale was created in New Haven Colony. And New Haven Colony was a separate colony from Connecticut Colony at that time. So the New Haven Colony had land in what is now New Haven, the New Haven County, what's now still New Haven County. And it also had land in Long Island, which is now Long Island, New York, and even as far south as Philadelphia. So it wasn't a colony the way we think of a state today, where, usually aside from like what, Alaska, or maybe, I don't know, most states, or Michigan would be really the only example. Like Michigan is the only example of a state, right, where there's kind of like a piece of land that isn't connected to the rest of it, that's not an island, right? Because you have the Upper
The
Peninsula,
Upper Peninsula, yeah.
not a part of mainland, the glove of Michigan, right? So like that's kind of how the New Haven colony looked. Like it wasn't like one central area. It was multiple different areas that were all part of the New Haven government. And Yale formed there, and then eventually the Connecticut colony struck a deal with Saybrook Colony. They all became Connecticut Colony, and then they struck a deal with New Haven Colony, and they had like joint governorship over the colony of Connecticut. So there was originally two capitals for this colony, well, one in New Haven and one in Hartford. And that's kind of, I guess it made sense in the time of horse and buggy, right? You don't want to wait for, days and days for an important decision is to be made and then told, down the chain of communication. So, in those days, New Haven had its own kind of autonomous government that was, I don't know the exact term, but essentially it was a church-run government. So like the church fathers who were in charge of the original Church of New Haven were kind of also at the seat of government, along with anybody who was sort of like a prominent elected part of the church, right? And back then, a church didn't necessarily mean building, right? Like now we think of the word church and we think a building. They didn't call it that. A church was a group. You know, that was a group of people, and the building was like your meeting house or a temple, depending on what denomination or religion. Um, so yeah, it was a very different way of government, but a lot of the things that were written into the articles of the New Haven Constitution of Government, they actually used the word constitution, I believe. That those some of those foundational ideas made their way into the United States Constitution. And the British government, which was trying to sew up control over all the colonies prior to the Revolutionary War and the Boston, all the things that happened in Massachusetts that kind of kicked off the Revolutionary War. Prior to that, England tried to take over Connecticut, and the government of Connecticut was like, Psh, screw you, you're not taking us over. We're gonna constitute ourselves. We're gonna govern ourselves. So they hid their articles because back then, if you destroyed somebody's paper that said that they were a legal entity, you won, right? Now they're yours, right? So back then, Connecticut had like this charter from a previous monarch that wasn't in power anymore, and the current monarch was like, no, that doesn't mean anything. Go get it, burn it up, rip it up. And Connecticut's like, no, 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 you're not going to get it. So they hide it inside of this oak tree, and it became the charter oak tree, right? So you have like this interesting, I don't know, maybe I'm getting all like poetic here, but you have like the oak tree and the elm tree, right? That are both very important to this story somehow. But yeah, so the oak tree is the charter oak tree is no longer standing. It got struck by lightning probably around the same time that the federal government came into fruition. God was like, well, you screwed up. Boom, there goes your charter oak tree. But yeah, so that happened. And I think a lot of people, again, it's not most people's fault. Most people aren't history nerds, but you start thinking about what we were taught in school, and we're given like these really kind of like ba-boom, ba-boom, ba-boom kind of beats to the story without any of the details, right? And we're given these beats to the story, and then eventually like that beat gets simplified, and now we're like not even really playing the same song we were originally playing. And that's kind of what's happening a lot now with the university systems. And I think, again, going back to this revolutionary time period, Yale, Harvard were British institutions. So they saw, I mean, not outright, there were patriots, especially more so at Harvard than at Yale. But yeah, so that it's complicated, but I hate to speak in like absolutes with any of this because it's you're talking about like hundreds of years. So many things kind of shifted back and forth during these periods of history. And I think the War of 1812 is one of these time periods where you're kind of like, what really happened there with the English and the Americans? So I've just recently started going into that period of history. I don't know, what I'll find quite yet, but my suspicions are I've laid them out so far pretty clearly. I think you're kind of on board with me at this point, whether you agree with me or not. Maybe you understand where I'm going with all this, but yeah, I think when it comes to the government of the United States, the Constitution is probably its only saving grace at this point.
There was a lot of high-ranking people that has been in high-ranking government positions and lucrative businesses that have all stemmed from Skull and Bones. And you just mentioned the War of 1812. A little side note. I live not too far from an area where they have a reenactment for the War of 1812. And I've never been out and watched the reenactment, but for some reason there's like some big battle that happened out here about 20 or so miles from where I live. And I think once a year they used to go out and do reenactments there.
Really? That's interesting you say that because I just learned about a reenactment that goes on not too far from me, maybe about an hour and a half's drive down to the shore. And there's a town called Essex, named after the Essex of England. And Essex is a shipping town, or at least was more so a shipping town back in these days, and they actually built a lot of ships in Essex. And during the War of 1812, there was an embargo, and ships were currency. You know, they were trading ships as currency. So the English were spying on Essex, and they came over and they burnt all these ships that were at port in Essex. And now they commemorate this with like a private ceremony every so often. I don't know if it's every year or, but they commemorate it. And what's interesting is on the Wikipedia page, when you read about the history of this town, they mention, you know, this great disaster where the English came and how Essex is one of the only towns in American history to ever be attacked by a foreign power. So, but they mentioned that, you know, rumor says that when the boats arrived, they didn't start firing and killing people and burning the town down because the mayor or somebody like the mayor, I don't know if they had a proper mayor, but somebody like that came out and greeted the British officers with a Freemasonic greeting or gesture. And that's where, you know, the British were probably like, oh, he's one, you know, he's a brother Mason. Let's, you know, spare the rod, you know, and just came here for what we came here for, and just burn all the ships, right? So they burn a bunch of ships, they steal a couple ships, and then they get trapped with the tide. So now the villagers are like, screw this, screw the Freemasons, we're just gonna open fire. They just, you know, cost us a fortune, right? It was like $200,000 worth of damage in that time's money. We're talking, you know, Revolutionary War, 1812, right? So it's a lot of money. Um, so yeah, they fired some shots off, and then the British kind of, they had to abandon their prize, and but they did successfully attack the town of Essex. But you just jogged that memory loose when you said that about the reenactment, and even though it's not publicized, I kind of want to go down there and see what goes on. Maybe they do a Freemasonic gesture in this parade.
Yeah. So I have no idea if they even still do it over there. I just know, strangely enough, and my show, we dabble into all sorts of things like weird conspiracies, obviously alien stuff, UFOs, cryptids, all sorts of topics. And when I was in school, we always called this place Hobbit Land because there was a story out there that people would go to do their little Rhodian adventures, and they would always see little humanoids running around out there. And they're like, oh, little hobbits, because this was back in the early 2000s. So obviously Lord of the Rings was really popular. And then come to find out lately, I've come across the term puckwudgies, and that's been associated with that whole area. So it's kind of strange. It's like, I wonder if what people were actually seeing back then was actually what these puckwudgie things were supposed to be, that's supposedly out in these woods. But if it's also a battleground, you'd also think there's spirits out there. So it's kind of one of those weird things. Like, I never see anything when I was ever out there, but apparently other people have.
Well, sometimes I have that same sort of feeling going to places like, oh, how come I don't see anything, you know? But yeah, sometimes the feeling is enough. Like I was just actually driving through a pretty remote place last week, and I stopped out of the car to at the side of like a river, a nice little pull off, and you know, let nature take its course. I had to take a leak, and I just got this really eerie feeling, like standing there. I don't know, maybe I was disrespecting a sacred river by urinating in it or something. I have no clue. I've never really explored that part of the Berkshires before. I live kind of close to like this mountain chain called the Berkshires. It's like the southern end of the Green Mountains that go up into Vermont. And there's been a few weird UFO sightings in the Berkshires, and apparently a guy got taken into an underground facility after being lifted aboard onto a craft willingly. He takes great umbrage with the fact that people have called his experience an abduction because he is very adamant that the beings were helping him and made his life better afterwards. But yeah, it's kind of funny. I just found that out recently as well, doing a little bit of research over here at my computer. And yeah, I just think to myself, like, oh, yeah, I recently moved into a new area. Let me go out and drive and see what I find. So I don't have much in the way of like paranormal experiences myself either. I have made a habit of going to places where weird things have said to happen. And I've definitely had that weird feeling. I think animals tend to be how my experiences with spirit or the other world, manifests through animals for some reason. Like I'll have a lot of strange close encounters with animals. I've seen everything from I've pretty much seen every type of animal in my biome, which is not easy feat. You really got to go out of your way to see some of these creatures. Black, probably yeah, cougar is probably the only mountain lion, cougar. They say they do run around in these parts, but I've never seen one myself, and I really don't want to see one either. Because
Yeah.
I'd probably be hiking if I see one, not in my car, and yeah, that's scary. So, anyways, but yeah, I think when it comes to like weird and paranormal and cryptids, like the place is the common denominator, and I said that recently on my show because I've been talking about cryptids a lot on a few different episodes that have come out in the past few months, and there's just a lot of it's fresh on my mind, and I'm not exactly like a cryptid hunter by any means. I don't really make trips out to do that kind of thing, but I want to now. Now that I live in a place that's a little bit more remote, it's less of a hike to get out into the woods, and there's really not a lot of people in some of the places that I could go to. So I'm like, maybe I should just start there and see which place is the least popular for people to hike and then hike there, you know?
Yeah. I will off air. I do this quite a bit. My listeners probably like, he always says that, but I don't want to talk about it on air because that's not the point of my show. But I will, when we're done recording, I'll fill you in on my weird cryptid experience. It's the reason I do my podcast.
Oh, wow. So let me ask you this. If you appeared on another podcast, would you share that story, or is that something that you're just like, it was so deep or so shocking, frightening, however you felt about it, so extreme that you just won't talk about it? How do you feel about that?
I've talked about it on other shows or whatever, and I've even mentioned it on here. I just don't want to.
Okay, I get what you're saying. You just don't want to repeat and
Yeah.
okay, I hear what you're saying.
No, I've mentioned it before. Like, no, I did this podcast for over a year and I never mentioned it because I was still iffy about talking about it because the name of your podcast resonates really well with me because literally I felt crazy talking about it because I felt like everyone thinks you're crazy if you bring this type of shit up. And I'm just like, I don't know how to go about it. So I didn't talk about it. So for 15 years, I never mentioned it. And when I finally did mention it to someone, we sat in awkward silence. Then I was like, well, this guy thinks I'm crazy. So, but I felt a little bit better. So I was like, you know what? I already had this podcast I did going on since we call it the Beast Era, 2020. And I never started it. I just had the idea, had the name. And then finally in 2022, summer 22, I said, screw up. I'm just going to go for it. So that's when I started it up and I started interviewing people. And the first couple of people I've interviewed were all cryptid type stuff because that is what resonated with me because I wanted to hear other people's experiences about it. So I didn't feel so much crazy myself. But
yeah, I relate to that for sure. And it's a lot easier to take the name of my show lightly now that I've spoken to so many people that can relate. Because yeah, for sure, originally it was, for me, it was not like something, it wasn't a cross that I bared with like pride, you know. I'm like, ah, yeah, my family thinks I'm crazy. You know, because I'm a social guy. I like to be extroverted, but I also really, really, really cannot stand any sort of superficiality or small talk or anything like that. So I just really cut to the meat of things a lot, or I'm just not in the conversation. Like if somebody starts asking me like how my week's been or whatever, like I usually get really detailed really fast. And sometimes, you know, people just they can't handle that. And that's made me feel crazy, probably made me feel like I need an outlet for this stuff, and now I have it. And it actually it's funny because now I don't really care so much about talking about this stuff with people. I just kind of exist and do my thing, and if people ask, I talk about it, you know. But very much before I started the podcast, it was like, you know, and it was the only thing I could talk about was like, oh, do you see what's going on in the world? And this was all like 2014, 15, 16, 17, like, you know, really got obvious in the beast time, as you call it. I like that term. And yeah, that's exactly, I mean, that's who I was working for, the beast, Amazon, you know, and I just was like, oh, this, at first I'm like, oh, this is cool. I can smoke weed on the job and nobody bothers me about it. I can listen to podcasts all day for like 8 hours and I'm making better money than I'd, you know, 'cause I'm a blue collar guy. Like I dropped out of community college because I'm like, yeah, no, I'll just figure it out. And you know, I'm still figuring it out, right? Like I'm living in an apartment. I got bills to pay. You know, this I'm not doing Joe Rogan next month. You know, so like it's definitely it's definitely like a choice I had to make, and I feel like you know, I feel like I found something that I really enjoy doing. Sometimes I feel like a starving artist, but other times I'm like, this is exactly where I need to be. And so, yeah, I don't know if I'm helping by telling people that the history they were told is a lie, but I think it's better to know the truth than to know all these comforting, fluffy nonsense, you know, myths that were given about, you know, the pilgrims and the Indian cutting turkey and, you know, all this other crap. Like it's all crap. George Washington and the cherry tree, Abraham Lincoln couldn't tell a lie. Like all this, it's just all crap. You
It's
know?
all manufactured to make it all sound fluffy and better for everybody else because they don't want to have the gory, bloody details of how they came over here and slaughtered everyone and all the way they screwed people around and everything else.
Well, and that's even like you know, I'm with you there to a certain degree, but like, yeah, man, I would love to come back on the show to get into that because you know, with the whole Native American conversation, like, yeah, there were the battles, the wars, the you know fighting on the reservations, but a lot of that stuff happened, you know, after the colonies were already kind of established. The original like fights and battles that happened with the Native Americans happened up in New England, and they went out on a little differently than how they played out in like you know the 1800s in the Wild West. Like by then the guys who had fought the you know original natives up in the Northeast had kind of calibrated the playbook to a certain degree and knew how to maybe fight these you know guerrilla warfare fighters, right? Like Native Americans did not play, you know, let's stand in a line and shoot cannons at each other, right? And that's not really what they were doing in the 1600s. They had muskets, and I'm sure they were kind of still conforming to an older, more, I don't know if you could call it civilized, but what do you call it? Like a more fancy version of fighting a war, right?
Yeah.
Like European version where they all line up and somebody's
Line up and have to stuff their guns with powder and
yeah, somebody's sitting on a horse with binoculars like 30 yards behind them, like, run, get them. Yeah. So they had to figure out like, oh wow, no, these native guys, they have bows and arrows, and yeah, sure we have guns, but you know, they're starting to get guns pretty fast. And yeah, it was tough. Like there's a whole lot of secrets with the whole like Native Americans up here in the Northeast, and yeah, a lot of them died from diseases and war, but a lot of them are now alive today and like think they're white people. As crazy as that sounds, and now with like all the genetic testing, you'll have like the people who are like, oh yeah, I'm actually quarter such and such, or like, when I was growing up, you'd have like occasionally you have like a kid who would say like, oh yeah, my grandmother's Cherokee, and I'd be like, what? The Cherokee aren't even from around here. Where are you from? Like,
Mhm.
but it is true that there was a lot of like mixing, and a lot of immigrants from Europe came around into America around that same time that the Native Americans on the East Coast were being displaced, and the ones that didn't leave and go west, the natives that didn't leave and go west, they assimilated and became kind of like Christian Indians. And there's a whole history of that, and Yale's kind of connected to that because they created what was called the Stockbridge School in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, and it was like a place where they would indoctrinate Native Americans out of their language. And it's not really I mean, from a one perspective, sure, it's indoctrination, but from another perspective, like a lot of those people were willingly learning this stuff. Like they weren't being forced to give up their culture. The way things were going, they realized like, oh, like it's either die or become Christian. I guess I'll just become Christian. Like you killed my whole tribe. What else could I do?
Right.
Like, at that point, yeah, it is kind of like it's kind of being forced, but it's more complicated than that. So yeah, it's a very weird history, and at the same time, like we get this whole idea that we live in a Christian nation, and yeah, there's tons of Christians, but at the beginning of the colonies, a lot of the people that came here were trying to escape the Christian governments of Europe. So who would have wanted to escape the Anglican government of Europe, of England, or the Catholic government of France, or the Catholic government of Spain? People who didn't conform to the status quo religion, right? I'm pretty sure the Dutch were Protestant, right? So like, and there were different groups of like Protestants that didn't agree with the official Protestantism, and so all sorts of different medleys of belief came to America, and that's really where like these secret societies found, I think, some ground, some grip to really like work on the culture, because you have all these different people who were kind of against the system that was against them, and then they become the system that's now against traditional values, right? And which is very much what people are seeing now. And I think a lot of people are becoming more conservative because of that. And I don't know that's necessarily a good thing, because when I was younger, like conservative was the bad guys, right? That's George Bush and 9/11. That's the conservatives, right? So it is two wings of the same bird in that sense. And I don't really play politics too much, especially when it comes to history. You got to take yourself out of that to a certain extent and put yourself in when it's appropriate. But yeah,
I'm not political at all. If anyone's listening, and I literally hate it. I think you wing from the same bird. It's the same
yeah,
side of the coin. Like
yeah, I hear you.
they're all. There's no one really out there trying to better us. Like it's all about them and their lining their pockets and everything else. I don't think anyone is really concerned with the American people.
Yeah.
At least not in the grand scheme of things. I think maybe some of these people actually get voted in. They have good ideas. They want to help, but I think once they realize what they get into, that's not really what it ends up being. But like I said, I don't try and dabble into politics on here too much, just because it's such a gray area.
Right. No, I'm with you. And I mean, for me, it's more about not alienating either side of the audience, but it's very hard to very
Yeah.
hard to support anything the left has espoused these in the past so many years. So yeah. But anyways, I'd love to come back on
Yeah.
the future to talk more about like the whole Native American history that's been left out, both prior to the European colonization and post. But according to my research, there were Europeans in North America way before Columbus. So it's like, when do you even put the goalpost, and do you even like have to make that, like clarification, like, oh, this anything before this time there were no white people in America? Like, what? No, that's crazy. There's no such thing. There's no borders like that. Like, people have been traveling all over the world for thousands of years. It's ever since boats existed, they've been sailing the seven seas. This whole idea that Europe discovered it in the age of discovery is nonsense. So yeah, if you want to have me back on, I can maybe support why I think that. I hope I've pointed people in some direction with the whole New Haven conversation, and I have a ton of podcasts on my own show, My Family Thinks I'm Crazy podcast, wherever you listen to podcasts, where you can learn more about Skull and Bones. And then I've done a ton of appearances, probably more. You could probably learn more from the times I've been on other shows, at least because I've only interviewed a few people about Skull and Bones, whereas I've done many episodes like this one. And the cool thing about it is, like, for me, someone who's kind of a stoner and maybe a little bit all over the place, like, all of it is recorded. So now, instead of it just existing in my memory, my foggy memory, I can go and like actually re-listen to stuff and be like, oh yeah, I forgot that one part. Let me add that to this new project. So there are many, I'd have many ideas on where I'm going to take this, as far as like whether I'm going to put it into a book or a video of some kind, a podcast series. But yeah, follow up with me on myfamilythinksimcrazy.com, and wherever you find the podcasts by the same name, just search it and you'll find all the things.
Pretty much anywhere you can find my show, Tinfoil Tells, you can find My Family Thinks I'm Crazy. Well, I'll definitely have you back on because I do want to dive into that whole topic. So we'll get something scheduled here off air and go from there. But I want to say it's been a pleasure talking with you, and I appreciate you coming on here and speaking with me.
Thank you. Yeah, no, thanks for letting me share my thoughts and opinions, and especially the facts, the things that I've researched and remember and can piece together, and I hope what is an interesting and coherent story of some kind. I don't know. But yeah, thank you. I appreciate it. It's always fun to talk about this topic, as so many people know very little about just the general subject of history. It's always cool to talk to someone who knows something, or at the very least appreciates history.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I agree with that. I hope the listeners enjoyed it too. But on that note, I want to thank you again for coming on here and talking to me. I want everyone to make sure to go check out My Family Thinks I'm Crazy podcast. And I want to say thanks for listening, but we're going to roll on out of here. So thanks to Mark, and thanks for listening. Good night, everyone. Remember, the truth lies in the stories we share, the connections we make. Stay curious, stay open-minded. Thank you all for joining us on this journey, and until next time, keep questioning, keep seeking, and keep exploring the unknown. Good night, everyone.